Camp Hero, Long Island, November 1980. The radar dish was spinning with no power, broadcasting memories that were never supposed to surface. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you a tale where the Cold War's darkest experiments never truly ended, and some soldiers never really come home. By 1980, the Cold War had settled into a deadly routine of electronic surveillance and psychological warfare. Camp Hero, perched on the windswept cliffs of Montauk Point, represented the cutting edge of America's early warning system. Its massive AN, FPS-35 radar dish could detect Soviet bombers 300 miles out, giving precious minutes of warning before nuclear annihilation. The facility had been humanity's electronic eye, watching the skies for the end of the world. Officially, Camp Hero had been decommissioned in September 1980, another victim of military budget cuts, as the Reagan administration shifted defense priorities. The radar went silent, the bunkers were sealed, and the installation joined the growing list of abandoned Cold War relics dotting the American coastline. The radar dish was spinning, with no power. Staff Sergeant Caleb Voss pressed his face against the transport window, watching the impossible sight unfold before him. The massive installation rotated slowly against the November sky, its 40-story bulk moving with mechanical precision despite being disconnected from any power source for months. "That's not possible," Lieutenant Adrian Hart whispered beside him, her equipment bag forgotten in her lap. She checked the classified briefing document again, as if the paper might explain what they were witnessing. Signal bursts disrupting Navy sonar grids, anomalous electromagnetic interference. They didn't mention the damn thing was still operational. Private Sean Duvall leaned forward from the back seat, his pale face reflecting the gray afternoon light. At 22, he'd already earned a reputation as one of the Army's most gifted signals intelligence specialists. "The frequency analysis I ran," he said quietly. "The interference patterns aren't random. There's linguistic structure to them, like the base is communicating." Voss studied the rotating dish with 20 years of military experience, telling him to trust what he saw, even when it defied explanation. The briefing had been sparse, the kind of orders that came from offices without names, signed by colonels who existed only on classified personnel lists. 3 soldiers sent to investigate what entire naval intelligence divisions couldn't explain. The transport passed through the abandoned main gate, where rust-stained signs still warned of restricted access and authorized personnel only. Beyond the checkpoint, Camp Hero spread across the coastal bluffs like a concrete cancer, its bunkers and utility buildings connected by roads that had already begun to crack from Atlantic salt and November frost. "Sergeant," Hart said, her voice carrying the kind of professional calm that came from years of following orders without question, "my radiation detector is picking up readings. Low level but consistent. The entire base is warm." Duvall pulled out his portable spectrum analyzer, a device barely larger than a radio that could detect electromagnetic signatures across military frequencies. The display lit up immediately, showing wave patterns that pulsed with organic rhythm. "It's not just warm," he said, staring at the readout. "It's singing." The transport dropped them at the main administrative building, its engine retreating into the November afternoon until only the sound of Atlantic wind remained. Voss shouldered his pack and studied the facility spread before them. Camp Hero looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a decommissioned radar base slowly surrendering to salt air and neglect, except for the dish that continued its impossible rotation overhead. Hart deployed her equipment with practiced efficiency, setting up a portable communications array that would maintain contact with their command base on Long Island. The radio crackled to life immediately, filling with static that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the rotating radar above them. "Base, this is Recon Team Alpha," she spoke into the handset. "We're on site and beginning initial survey." The response came through layers of interference, barely recognizable as human speech. Alpha, proceed with, investigate source of, maintain contact every. Base, you're breaking up, Hart replied, adjusting frequency settings that should have provided crystal clear communication across such a short distance. Please repeat last transmission. Only static answered. Duval had already begun taking electromagnetic readings, his spectrum analyzer painting the air around them in waves of colored light on its small display. Sergeant, the emissions are strongest near the main bunker complex, he reported, pointing toward a cluster of concrete structures built directly into the coastal bluffs. Whatever's generating power for that radar, it's coming from underground. They approached the bunker entrance, a heavy steel door marked with radiation warnings and security classifications that had been obsolete for years. The lock had been cut recently, leaving clean metal shavings scattered on the concrete step. Someone else had been here. Inside, emergency lighting flickered along corridors that stretched deeper into the earth than any of them had expected. The walls were lined with cables thick as a man's arm, all pulsing with a faint blue glow that suggested electrical current flowing through systems that should have been dead for months. This doesn't match the blueprints, Hart whispered, consulting a schematic from their briefing materials. According to these plans, the bunker only extends 2 levels down. This corridor goes much deeper. They descended through layers of military construction that seemed to span decades. The upper levels showed typical 1970s installation work, gray concrete and functional design intended to withstand nuclear attack. But as they went deeper, the architecture changed. Older tiles appeared on the walls, equipment housings that looked more like something from the 1950s, and finally, at the deepest level they could access, rooms that felt almost experimental in their purpose. Duval stopped at an intersection where 4 corridors met, his equipment registering massive electromagnetic activity from all directions. The signals are coming from everywhere down here, he said, his young face pale in the emergency lighting. It's like the entire base is one giant transmission device. That's when they heard it, a sound that shouldn't exist in an abandoned military facility, the soft, rhythmic breathing of someone sleeping. Hart drew her sidearm instinctively, years of training taking over, even as her rational mind struggled to process what they were experiencing. The breathing came from a sealed room marked with warnings they couldn't read, text that looked like English but somehow remained incomprehensible no matter how long they stared at it. Voss approached the door, noting that it too had been recently opened, its electronic lock bypassed by someone with considerable technical skill. Beyond the threshold lay a small chamber, filled with equipment he didn't recognize. Chairs connected to elaborate electronic arrays, monitoring devices that tracked biological functions, and screens displaying brainwave patterns that pulsed in perfect synchronization with the radar dish rotating far above them. In the center chair sat a figure in a military uniform, identical to their own. The figure in the chair didn't move when they entered. Hart kept her weapon trained on the motionless form while Voss approached, his boots echoing against walls that seemed to absorb sound. The uniform was Army Standard issue, identical to their own, down to the unit patches. "Sir, identify yourself," Hart commanded, her voice steady despite finding someone alive in a facility sealed for months. The figure remained still, head tilted back, eyes closed in peaceful sleep. Electrodes attached to his temples pulsed with blue light. Monitoring equipment displayed vital signs, indicating deep REM sleep patterns. The biometric readings show 72 hours of continuous connection. Duval reported from a nearby terminal, his voice tight with confusion. Brain activity monitoring, but no physical distress. Voss reached to check the figure's pulse and froze. The face was familiar in a way that made his stomach lurch. Young features, pale complexion suggesting too much time underground. "That's Private Collins from Fort Detrick," Hart whispered, lowering her weapon. I processed his transfer orders 6 months ago. He was supposed to be in Germany. The nameplate confirmed it, Collins M. But something was wrong. The uniform looked too new, showing none of the wear from months of active duty. The boots showed no scuffing, no actual use. Duval found a logbook, reading aloud entries that made his hands shake. Day 68. Subject demonstrates continued responsiveness to frequency modulation. Memory integration, proceeding within acceptable parameters. Note: subject occasionally calls out for Noah during deep phase sleep. Voss felt something cold settle in his chest. Noah, his son's name, the boy who had died in an accident that no one here should know about. Hart accessed files requiring no security clearance despite containing classified information. Dozens of records here, all Army personnel, all reported as transferred overseas. She paused at a photograph that made her step back. "Sergeant, you need to see this." The image showed a child, maybe 10 years old, sitting in the same chair, electrodes attached to his small head, eyes wide with terror. The child's face bore features Voss recognized from mirrors and old family photographs. The nameplate read, Subject MB, 47, Voss Caleb, age 10, memory suppression successful, phase 2 conditioning approved. Collins stirred, eyelids fluttering as monitoring equipment registered brain activity changes. When he opened his eyes, they fixed on Voss, with recognition born of shared experience. "You brought us back," Collins said, his voice carrying the flat affect of deep sedation. "You always bring us back here, Noah, just like they programmed you to." The name hit Voss like a physical blow. His dead son's name, spoken by a stranger who shouldn't know it existed. Hart disconnected Collins from the monitoring equipment, hands shaking as she removed electrodes that left red marks on his skin. The soldier remained conscious but distant, eyes tracking movements with mechanical precision. "How long have you been here?" Voss asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Time doesn't work the same way down here," Collins replied, sitting up slowly. "Sometimes it's 1972. Sometimes it's now. The machines help us remember which is real." Duval's equipment detected massive surges from deeper in the complex. "We need to move. The system is responding to his disconnection." Collins led them deeper, past rooms filled with equipment decades older than anything officially deployed at Camp Hero. His movements carried practiced efficiency, as if he'd walked these corridors many times. "They called us the Montauk boys," Collins said, voice gaining strength. "Children with specific profiles, high intelligence, social isolation, family trauma. They found us in orphanages, foster homes, military families." Hart documented everything with her camera, though images appeared distorted. "What kind of experiments?" "Memory manipulation, consciousness projection. They wanted soldiers who could operate without normal psychological limitations." Collins paused at a steel door marked with symbols that hurt to look at. "But they had to break us first. Completely." The door revealed a vast chamber filled with dozens of identical chairs. Most were empty, but several held figures in military uniforms, faces peaceful in artificial sleep. Voss recognized faces from Army personnel files, soldiers reported as transferred years earlier. "They never stopped," Collins continued, moving between chairs with disturbing familiarity. "The official program ended in the 80s, but the facility kept running. Automated systems would activate whenever subjects returned." Duval found a control station displaying biographical information for each subject. These files show childhood trauma assessments, IQ measurements, and something called reality anchor compatibility ratings. One file made Voss's blood freeze. His own name appeared, complete with childhood photographs and evaluations dating to age 7. The document described a boy with exceptional abilities but excessive emotional attachment to family structures. The accident that killed your son, Collins said, reading over Voss's shoulder. It wasn't random. They needed you isolated, psychologically vulnerable. Grief makes the mind more receptive to restructuring. Hart backed away from the monitors. You're saying they murdered a child to make his father into a test subject? They did whatever was necessary, Collins replied, his matter-of-fact tone more terrifying than any outburst. Most subjects never remembered being here. They would leave, live normal lives, and return only when programming required activation. The facility's pulses grew stronger, and Voss felt something shifting in his memory, like puzzle pieces rearranging themselves without permission. The memories came flooding back in fragments that felt like broken glass cutting through Voss's consciousness. A sterile white room, electrodes attached to his small head, a man in a lab coat asking him to describe the color of sounds, his 10-year-old self screaming for his mother until they administered something that made the screaming stop forever. You're remembering, Collins observed, watching Voss stumble against a monitoring station. The suppression protocols are failing. They always do when subjects return to the source location. Hart tried to maintain rational observation, documenting with her camera, but the device now showed only static. How many times have we been here before? Duval stared at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. The electromagnetic signatures aren't coming from the facility. They're coming from us. We're the transmission sources. Collins led them to another chamber filled with mannequins dressed in military uniforms identical to their own. Each figure bore their nameplate: Voss, Hart, Duval. The faces were anatomically perfect reproductions, down to scars and birthmarks. Every time you complete a mission here, they create backups, Collins explained, running fingers along Hart's mannequin face. Physical templates for when the original subjects become too damaged to continue. The facility has been running the same mission parameters for decades. Hart touched her own face, comparing it to the lifeless reproduction. How many times have we died here? Death is just another form of data, Collins replied. The important thing is maintaining mission continuity. You'll investigate, discover the truth. Voss will remember his conditioning, and then the facility will reset everything for the next cycle. Voss discovered a video monitor displaying surveillance footage from previous missions. The screen showed teams identical to theirs, having the same conversations they'd just finished. Dozens of iterations spanning years, each ending with team members connected to chairs and their memories harvested before termination. The accident that killed Noah, Voss said, voice hollow with recognition. It happened after one of these missions, didn't it? Your son died in 1979. Collins confirmed. You discovered the truth during a mission similar to this one. The grief was necessary to reset your psychological baseline for continued participation. The facility's pulses intensified, and Hart felt her own memories shifting. She remembered processing Collins's transfer orders, but now also remembered processing them dozens of times before, always with the same confusion. Duval recalled previous visits to this exact chamber, conversations with Collins that ended with his consciousness being downloaded while his body was disposed of without trace. We're not investigating. We're performing the same script, over and over. The monitors displayed personal information tracking their responses across multiple mission iterations. Voss's file showed declining effectiveness after repeated memory wipes, with notes about creating increasingly traumatic reset events to maintain his operational parameters. The beautiful thing about consciousness transfer, Collins said, is that you never truly die. You just get archived until the next iteration needs you. The facility's deepest level contained a single room that had haunted Voss's suppressed memories for decades. The Montauk chair sat in the center like a metallic throne, scarred by years of use and surrounded by equipment that hummed with patient malevolence. This was where they had broken him as a child. It's beautiful, isn't it? Collins said, approaching the chair with reverence. 40 years of refinement, and it can still rewrite a human consciousness in under 3 hours. Technology that won't be officially discovered for another decade. Hart backed toward the exit, but the door had sealed itself. Her equipment felt heavier with each step, filled with evidence that would never see daylight. "We can still get out. The transport is waiting." "You've filed that report before," Collins replied, gesturing to a cabinet filled with identical documents bearing their signatures. 16 times, each time recommending permanent closure, each time forgotten when the next cycle begins. Duval found himself drawn to the chair, despite every instinct screaming at him to run. The metal was warm, pulsing with energy that synchronized with his heartbeat. "What happens if we refuse this time?" "The facility has contingencies," Collins explained, settling into a control station. "Automated protocols ensure mission completion, regardless of subject cooperation. The chair doesn't require conscious participation." Voss stared at the device that had stolen his childhood, his son, and decades of his life. Psychological profiles scattered nearby showed his deteriorating effectiveness with each cycle, notes about increasing resistance, and suggestions for more aggressive intervention. "Noah wasn't my first son, was he?" Voss asked, buried memory surfacing. "There were others. Other children they used to reset me when the programming degraded." Collins nodded with clinical detachment. 4 children across 30 years. Each death carefully orchestrated to generate specific trauma necessary for consciousness restructuring. The facility required someone with your psychological profile. Hart processed the implications, hands shaking. A government program that murdered children to maintain control over a single test subject. For what purpose? "Perfect soldiers," Collins replied, beginning startup sequences that filled the room with vibrations. Operatives who could function without limitations of normal human psychology. Fear, guilt, attachment, all obstacles to mission effectiveness. The chair's restraints opened with mechanical precision, waiting for Voss. He could see his reflection in the polished metal, a face worn down by decades of artificial trauma and reconstructed memories. "I remember now," Voss said, his voice carrying recovered truth. "Every mission, every reset, every time they killed someone I loved to break me down. And I remember something else." He pulled out his sidearm, weight familiar in ways suggesting he'd done this before. "I remember learning how to fight back." Collins's expression shifted from detachment to genuine concern. "The facility has countermeasures for armed resistance. You cannot escape the programming indefinitely." "Maybe not," Voss replied, aiming at the chair's central control unit. "But I can make sure this is the last cycle." Voss pulled the trigger, and the control unit exploded in a shower of sparks that filled the chamber with acrid smoke. The chair's restraints snapped shut reflexively, grasping at empty air while emergency lighting bathed everything in hellish red. For a moment, the only sound was the hiss of destroyed electronics and Hart's ragged breathing. "You've done this before, too," Collins said calmly, producing a backup control device from his jacket. "Cycle 14, you shot the primary systems. Cycle 9, you tried to collapse the entire bunker. The facility always has redundancies." The backup systems came online with mechanical efficiency, and the chair began powering up again. Duval watched helplessly as his equipment detected the same electromagnetic signatures building to lethal levels. They had never been in control of this situation. "The beautiful thing about consciousness transfer," Collins continued, activating sequences that made the air itself seem to vibrate, "is that resistance becomes just another data point to analyze and counter. Each iteration teaches the system how to better manage subject behavior." Hart found herself backing toward the chair despite every rational thought telling her to run. Her movements felt guided by invisible strings, muscle memory from previous cycles overriding conscious will. "We can't escape, can we? Not really. This has all happened before." 16 times, Collins confirmed. Sometimes you fight, sometimes you submit, sometimes you try to bargain. The outcome remains consistent. The mission parameters must be maintained. Voss felt his own body betraying him, feet carrying him toward the device that had defined his entire existence. The recovered memories showed him glimpses of previous attempts at resistance, all ending the same way, strapped to the chair while his consciousness was harvested and archived for the next iteration. The radar signal that brought you here, Collins explained as automated systems prepare the chair for operation. It's not random interference. It's a recall beacon, programmed to activate whenever subjects achieve critical distance from the facility. You can never truly leave, because part of you always remains here. Duvall's equipment registered massive power fluctuations as the facility's deepest systems came online. Through his spectrum analyzer, he could see the electromagnetic signatures of previous mission teams stored in the facility's memory banks, consciousness patterns waiting to be downloaded into fresh bodies when the current iteration concluded. "What about the others?" Hart asked, gesturing toward the sleeping figures they had found throughout the bunker. Collins, the soldiers in the chairs upstairs. "Archive subjects from previous programs," Collins replied, securing restraints that moved with practiced precision. "The facility maintains operational backups for all successful conditioning protocols. The Montauk boys who survived the initial experiments became templates for future operations." The chair's neural interface descended toward Voss's head, and he realized with crystalline clarity that his resistance had always been part of the program's design. They needed him to fight back, to generate the specific psychological patterns that made his consciousness valuable for military applications. "Noah," he whispered, and for the first time the name felt like a prayer rather than a wound. The electrodes made contact, and Caleb Voss felt his memories beginning to dissolve like sugar in water. Somewhere far above, the radar dish continued its eternal rotation, broadcasting patterns that would draw the next iteration of the team back to Camp Hero when the time was right. In 6 months, the signal would return. Different year, 1967. Same coordinates. Same mission. Staff Sergeant Caleb Voss would investigate anomalous electromagnetic interference, accompanied by Lieutenant Hart and Private Duvall. They would descend into the bunker, discover the truth about the Montauk boys, and fight against programming that had defined their existence for decades. And the cycle would begin again. If this transmission from the War Maestro archive left you questioning your own memories, it's time to join the patrol. Check your reflection carefully. Make sure you recognize the face staring back, and subscribe to access more classified horrors from military history's darkest corners. Hit that notification bell, because you'll want to know when the next signal broadcasts from places that officially don't exist. Share this story with fellow soldiers of the strange, who understand that the most terrifying battles aren't fought with bullets, but with the mind itself. Remember, the radar dish is always spinning, and some missions never truly end.